Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Small Business Spotlight powered by Northlight Film Co. My name is Derek, and we're here with Dr. Liz. Hi, thank you so very much for being on. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be here, and I am the founder of Migrating Toward Wholeness, which is a framework and methodology that I developed out of my own lived experience as an adopted person. And it comes out of the fact that I spent more than 15 years in therapy, never talking about being adopted, and turning to both creative writing, I wrote a lot of poetry, and also community theater as outlets for all of those super intense and overwhelming emotions that I felt from the time I was about 14 years old through most of the rest of my life that I didn't know was attached to the unresolved trauma that I had from maternal separation and being separated from my first mother. And so Migrating Toward Wholeness is really my mission and my purpose in life, to help other adoptees get to a place of healing and wholeness a lot sooner than I did. And I use creative writing, somatic awareness, and poetry to help folks to attach language to experiences that are pre-verbal, that don't often have language, which is actually why traditional therapy doesn't often help us in the way that it's supposed to. And so we need alternatives to support, and creativity is also profoundly healing for people who are impacted by trauma. So that's a little bit about what I do.
Yeah, well, on that note, you brought with you your book, which I want to definitely shout out. So with creative writing and the things, you mentioned the trauma that adoptees can go through. What does that look like? What happens that causes that trauma?
Yeah, so I can talk about it a little bit through the lens of my own experience, and then mirror that with the hundreds of adoptees that I know and are connected with and have either worked with or encountered over many years of doing this work. So for me, that looked like, early on when I was young, a lot of crying. I was very emotional. In fact, not helpful at all, but my dad used to say I was the queen of crocodile tears. Not super helpful language. It didn't come from a place of, like malice or anything like that. It was just, they thought I was just this really super weepy kid. The real issue was that I had been separated from my mother at birth and felt this profound sense of loss and detachment, which is really what in the research that's in my book that I've done over the years, the research that says that when we separate babies from mothers, there is a preverbal wound that occurs that changes the way the brain is wired. It changes the way the nervous system is wired. And so little baby Liz was trapped in a constant trauma response. Right. I was always looking for where the danger was coming from. I was always worried about if someone was going to leave me. So it looked like a lot of crying, a lot of over emotional reactions to things, because I didn't have words. But anytime something happened that felt like that original experience of loss, all of that stuff would get dragged up and activated, because my nervous system was operating at a much higher level than if I had stayed with my mother at birth, if I had been attached to her in the appropriate way, which is just like biology, right? Yeah. But biologically and neurologically, like there's a connection that happens between babies and mothers. And so when you separate them and that attachment is disrupted on both the biological and the neurological level, a lot of disruptions occur throughout the lifetime because of that nervous system disruption, because the whole body has been rewired by that experience of loss, right? And so then, of course, that's younger me over the course of my life that looked like a lot of failed relationships, a lot of unhealthy relationships. It looked like starting and stopping a lot of things. It felt like being in constant motion, but never getting anywhere. It looks like feeling like everything is always my fault. And these are not just true for me. These are true for almost nearly every single adoptee that I know that I have spoken to.
Yeah.
We all have the same internal experience of this separation.
That's an interesting point, because I think it seems like the stigma is, well, you found an adoptive family, so you're fine. does, I guess another question that kind of leads into that is, did that also manifest, like the trauma come out and manifest even in small losses?
Yeah, yeah. It's so, that you're right. So this idea that, adoption is the sort of band-aid or the solution to any host of things, right? Like so-called unwanted or crisis pregnancies, or that it's a solution to infertility. It's the band-aid that fixes, the people that want a family and can't do it by biological means, or they're called by God or whatever the narrative is. Those dominant narratives overtake the actual truth, right? And even in the instance of which my circumstance was that I was raised in a very loving and supportive family, and I'm still traumatized, right? There's a both and that gets missed when we want to look at adoption as just unicorns and rainbows and we put a kid in a loving family and everything's going to be okay. That's not true. We also know that the blank slate theory is also not true. There is such a thing as nurture and nature.
Yeah.
Right. And I have been raised in very nurturing ways, and there's a lot of things that I have been given because of being raised in a loving and supportive family, and none of that has erased the experience of trauma as it has shown up over the lifetime. And so your other question about, does it show up in small losses? Yes. It's things like that probably wouldn't activate a person with a regulated nervous system. It's losing something, right? Like just, misplacing something. And then it feels like the biggest thing in the world. Or sometimes it shows up in a lack of being able to make decisions because there's a lack of self-trust, right? Because if I was left at the beginning of my life, how can I even trust myself to make a decision about something as simple as like what kind of toothpaste to buy?
I love that you're on this podcast because I think it's something that I know I'm ignorant to. Like a lot of times, and I love learning. And in the process of learning, you learn the things that you're ignorant about.
Yeah.
And I know for me, I have had experiences, especially lately with a lot of people where I realize how much I don't know.
Yeah.
And especially in something like this, that you went through what on the outside may be, oh no, you were in a loving family. You were fine. But then the actual like neurological and biological impacts precede that. And like
Yeah.
I like the way that you put it, where it's like both things can be true. Yes, like a loving family is a positive, but you're right, it's not, it doesn't just magically fix everything. And I love learning that because I never realized that.
Yeah.
And so I understand that like stigma is stigma for a reason. Like the general public, like everybody's like, oh, this is how it works. And so I'm so glad to have you on for that. So I know one of the things that like a lot of people will think of is how an adoptee may feel like they were abandoned for a reason. Is that true? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So and this is again part of these dominant narratives, which is exactly why I developed Migrating Toward Wholeness, because it was really about needing to push back against all of these dominant narratives about adoption and adoptees and what our experiences are in order to make space for the truth. So the dominant narrative there is that our mothers didn't want us, right? That they were too young, they were incapable, they were, drug addicts or bad people or any number of those stereotypical things that you tend to hear in the media, most of which is not actually true. From a historical perspective, in the United States and in the UK and in Australia and New Zealand, for example, there is a history of forced and coerced adoption. So there's in the United States, it was called the baby scoop era, and it happened just after World War II. And it went through the early 1970s, right up until Roe v. Wade. And those decades of time, women that found themselves accidentally pregnant, out of wedlock, were sent to unwed mothers' homes, and they were forced to relinquish their children. They were told to give birth and forget about it. A lot of families, because they had worked so hard to, sort of climb their way into the middle class in those post-war years, and were really holding on to this ideal of the nuclear family as the American ideal because of the post-war rebuilding that was happening at the time. We as a nation, we needed to rebuild the state, and the way that happened was through nuclear families, right? And pushing this idea that the ideal family was a couple of kids and a mom and a dad and a dog and a house and a fence,
And
white
the
picket
picket
fence,
yeah.
right? That whole American dream was really, packaged and sold. And one of the ways into that American dream was through adoption, because there were families that could not, biologically have children. There were infertilities for whatever reasons. I have some theories about that, because of chemicals that men may have been exposed to during the war. Not sure, if anyone has done a lot of research on that, but it's a thing I've thought about for many years. But so these women who had lots of freedom, during the war years, because the men were at war.
Yeah.
They were working in the factories, and they had, a lot of not only like social freedom, but there was also some sexual freedom happening. Many of them got pregnant the first time they had sex, and they didn't know, and it was illegal to buy contraceptives. So like that wasn't a thing, and they ended up pregnant. And so in these post-war years, and then, as I said, in the subsequent decades, there was a huge amount of shame attached to getting pregnant outside of a marriage, especially if you were, 15 or 16 or 17. And families sent these young women away. There's a great book called The Girls Who Went Away, if anyone's interested in that history, which is also written by an adoptee named Ann Fessler, who's done some incredible work in our community. And so anyway, so really there's a historical precedent for this idea that we were unwanted. Most of those women would not have chosen to relinquish or surrender their babies.
Right.
And that continues to be historically true. I know that in my story, my first mother did not want to give me up. She wanted to keep me and parent me, but she had no choices. She had no support from her family. She was dating somebody other than the man who had gotten her pregnant, and the boyfriend that she was with refused to raise another man's child. And so we have, there's also some other societal pressures there too about what constitutes a family and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And she just had no choice.
Yeah.
Right. And so like a choice in the absence of choice is not a choice.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so and I can bring it up, into the current moment. There's a lot of really great grassroots family preservation work happening right now. In particular, one group is called Saving Our Sisters, and their data shows that most women who find themselves in a so-called crisis pregnancy only need between $2,000 and $5,000 to keep and parent their children. And so a lot of women in the current moment are still being forced into relinquishment because of a temporary financial crisis.
Right.
And historically, that was also the case, right? But then the underlying issue becomes, even if it's not true that our mothers didn't want us, because many of them did want us, that shame gets encoded in our DNA.
Right.
And so we still live with the internal, potentially like unconscious thought that we were unwanted, which is also one of the ways that the trauma manifests. Because if there's an internalized belief that I wasn't wanted, that I'm unworthy, then I'm going to make a lot of choices and a lot of decisions that support that.
Right.
Right.
So it's kind of like the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Like you believe something, so then you do things that end up manifesting that way.
Yeah. And it's not a conscious belief. That's part of the problem. And that's why the work that I do is so powerful, because it helps us to put language to those unconscious thoughts and beliefs that are just, like I said, encoded in our DNA, that live in our nervous systems and in our bodies. And once we start to see that language appear and tell a story about those parts of ourselves that have gone unrecognized and unspoken for so long, we can start to tell a new story.
Yeah.
And shift those unconscious beliefs and shift those harmful narratives that have kept us stuck,
Right,
or
right.
small, or in a place where we can't make decisions or trust ourselves.
Yeah, I love that. And I guess following that train of thought, then, like, the truth that not everybody knows. So I imagine you mentioned that there's like an actual biological process that happens when you're separated from your birth mother. Is that right? So what, we've talked about kind of like the stigmas, the general public perception of it, but what is the truth? What happens, and what are ways that we can bring the correct things to light instead of kind of just allowing the same things to permeate?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the greatest ways to conceptualize why maternal separation is a problem is to recognize that in recent years, hospitals have made it a law that skin to skin contact is necessary when babies are born.
Right.
And as soon as they're born, they are not taken away. They are given right to their mother and their skin to skin contact, because that bonding is really important.
Yeah.
Right? Those first moments, in addition to the previous 9 months, where 9 months, or however many months, I was born prematurely, so it wasn't quite 9 months, but that's all. Now we have all the research that supports how much bonding and like chemical and neurological connection there is during those months, that is setting up all of the networks that then, when babies are born, that then those synapses start to fire and they start to make connections, and the brain starts to recognize, okay, this is my mother's voice, this is what my mother smells like, this is what my mother sounds like, right?
Yeah.
Because we've had it from the inside. So when you separate a baby from its mother, at or shortly after birth, you remove any of those connections from being possible.
Right.
And then, in my particular case, because I was born prematurely, I was in the NICU in the 1970s. No skin to skin contact, right? Because it wasn't part of the research then. And then I spent several months, in interim foster care, which a time that I don't know a lot about. And I went home with my adoptive parents when I was about 9 months old.
Okay.
And developmentally speaking, the first 9 months of an infant's life are the most impactful developmentally. So if you're taking a baby from its mother, you're removing the ability for attachment, both on a biological and a neurological level. Nothing feels safe. Nothing feels comfortable. The world feels like a threat. And so one of the things that people can do is recognize that that family separation is a public health crisis. And what are the ways that we're talking about this? What language are we using to describe particular events? I was recently having a conversation with somebody who talked about their journey as an adoptive parent and how they had several failed adoptions. And even my doctor and I had a conversation, and she talked about people in her family and a failed adoption. And I said to this other person, let's not think about, like, is it really a failed adoption if that woman got to parent her own child? It might be failed on the part of the parents who were hoping to adopt, but it's not failed when you keep a baby and a mother together.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting. Wow. I mean, I don't have words for that, because it's not something that I would ever really known or understood, and for obvious reasons, but I think it is important to talk about those things, because it seems obvious after you talk about it, like skin to skin contact, having that, close bond with your child seems obvious after the fact, but when you're actually like, when the research hasn't been done, or when the research is something else, we do things that are wrong. And so I do want to talk a little bit about your perspective in growing up.
Yeah.
Because growing up, and you said you grew up in a loving family. So what was it like, your kind of struggle with having a loving family, but also having this like pre-adoption trauma that I assume lives with you,
Yeah.
Ongoing?
Yeah. It's hard because as a young person, I also have an older brother who's adopted. And we always knew. It wasn't like my parents, kept it from us.
Right.
Right. And that happens, right? There are a lot of adopted people that don't find out until much later, which is it's called late discovery adoptee. And that's a whole other challenge. Not dissimilar. It's just highly disruptive.
Yeah.
My brother and I knew we were adopted. It was never a secret. But then after several years, my mom ended up getting pregnant again, and had my younger brother, who's my parents' biological son, and he was born with Down syndrome. And that, once he was born, that really shifted the focus of our family, and we just kind of over time stopped talking about adoption, and it stopped being an open topic. And that was a problem, because then what happened for me as a young person, as a teenager in my 20s, I had a lot of mental health challenges, which everybody just said, oh, you're depressed, you're a girl, it's your hormones, right? All of those things, completely missing the boat that the underlying cause was the unacknowledged grief, loss, and trauma that I was living with, but didn't have language for, right? And so, so it's, and then the older I got, I had a lot of confusion, right? Because I knew that I came from somewhere else. I didn't know anything about my biological family. I didn't know what my ancestry or ethnicity was. And I have an award-winning solo show where I talk a little bit about this. It's called Unmothered. And I talk about, like, one of the things in the show, like specifically that I say is, I didn't actually know who my ancestors were or what my ethnicity was. Yeah. I just knew that I needed to keep pretending like I fit in, even when I felt like a stranger.
Right.
And that really sort of encapsulates my experiences, that like, I knew that I was loved. I knew that, my family, I had my grandparents and my parents and my cousins and my aunts and uncles. Everybody was around me, but I also always felt like I was always outside looking in, because I didn't look like anyone in my family, right? And I didn't sound like them. And I didn't always feel like, I didn't always feel quite connected in the way that I thought I should be.
Right.
But I couldn't have articulated that, 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
Of course, now I have a lot of language for it. But so that's the experience. It's this feeling of disconnect, right? It's this lack of connection, and having to, and we talk about this a lot in the adoptee groups that I run, having to shapeshift. We call it the sort of chameleon effect, where we're really good at fitting in, right, and reading the room. And like, yes, that can be a superpower, but it's also, for many of us, a lifelong coping strategy and survival skill that's really exhausting. Yeah.
I have a couple follow-up questions for that, because that was, there's so much great information that I want to break down there. Yeah. The first one being, you mentioned that growing up, you had a lot of emotional moments, a lot of times that you were depressed, you didn't have the language for it. And this can be a controversial take, but I think it's just a straight fact that a lot of times women are treated a lot differently than men in mental health spaces, because a lot of times it gets played off as anxiety or hormones or or whatever. Like I could walk into a therapist saying the same exact thing and be treated completely differently, which I think a lot of us want to believe doesn't happen as much anymore.
Yeah.
But I think the fact is it's just what happens. It's
Yeah.
kind of like we talked about, that underlying perception.
Yeah.
So what was your experience with that? Because I imagine it's got to be so hard to have these feelings and tell people about them. Like I'm sure it takes a lot to just talk about them in the first place, but then to kind of have it like brushed off as nothing. What is that like?
I mean, it's so disempowering, right? And it feeds into that continued lack of self-trust, right? Because if I'm trying to communicate what's going on with me, and you're right, like this is a historical and ongoing problem for women in both mental and medical care spaces,
Yes. Yeah.
healthcare spaces, is that our symptoms are ignored or chalked up to something other than what they actually are. And for me, I actually did have a significant amount of anxiety that went undiagnosed until I was in my late 30s. And I finally found adoption and trauma competent therapy and started doing the research that began my own, healing journey. I then started to put all the pieces together. But when you step into a space and you're trying to communicate that you're in pain, that you're hurting, that something is not right, and you're being told, "Oh, well, it's just your hormones. You're just hysterical," right? That's not, it's just not helpful. It actually, like, quite frankly, it feels shitty.
Yeah.
And then it makes you stop wanting to try. In fact, I ended up, breaking up. I joke about it a little bit, but breaking up with my therapist,
Yeah.
who I had been with for, the better part of more than 15 years, because every time I went in, I came out feeling worse. And it wasn't her fault. Right? It was just the function of the fact that it was the wrong kind of support for me, and that we weren't talking about the things that needed to be talked about, and we weren't using the appropriate modalities. And it took me another several years to figure out what I did need.
Right.
But the thing that I did in the in-between space was that I turned to creative practice, because that was the one place where I could find space to at least hear myself,
Right.
or be heard in a different way. So like when I talk about hearing myself, that was just all the poetry that I started writing from the time I was 14 years old, that I just wrote in secret, because every time I wrote something down, it made me feel better. And I knew that if I could put something on paper and get it out of me, I could kind of manage.
Yeah.
And then I also started doing a lot of theater at the time, and that was super helpful, because I could take all of the intense emotions that I didn't understand and all the things that I couldn't say to other people or tried to say but wasn't being heard about, and I could pretend to be another person and put all that in that other person's life for a little bit of time.
Yeah.
And so I could say for sure that those two things saved me. That if I had not had those two outlets, I probably wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you.
Right. No, I mean that's so powerful, because I know how creative outlets can really help, especially when you're struggling, like when you're going through something. So I wanna ask you one more question, then I want to kind of pivot to what it is that you offer to people. But I know, having talked about like adoptive children, and say you've got a family that adopts you, there's the people that believe we should make it an open discussion, and then the people that say we don't want to say anything until they're old enough to process it. But I want to kind of open that up to just in general, having gone through living your life experience. What are the ways that are positive and constructive when say you have a family that adopts a child? What are the ways that they can be supportive in those moments where they probably won't understand, because they think that we're a loving family. What else could you want? And not quite understanding that. So what would you say to all of that?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And again, through the lens of my own experience, my parents didn't know what they didn't know. Nobody was talking about the trauma of maternal separation in the mid to late 70s when my brother and I were adopted. Like it wasn't even quite yet on the radar. They were just starting to publish some of the research that was the foundational stuff in the field of critical adoption studies. And here we are decades later, almost 50 years later, and there's so much more research available. There's so much more support available to parents and families if they can be open to the both and so for families that are living the reality of adoption, which is a very complex family structure, you have to keep talking. They have to keep talking about it. And it has to be child-centered. It cannot be parent-centered. And that's part of the shift that's really important for us to make, not just as individuals, but as a culture.
Yeah.
Is that adoption, as it's currently practiced, is not necessarily in the best interest of the child.
I see.
And what often happens is that parents have a certain amount of fragility around the truth, and instead of continuing to keep the door open to those conversations that might be something like, where did I come from? Right? What is my other family like? Those doors get closed and it shuts down communication. And then a child learns that they have to protect the feelings of their parents. And so they swallow the questions. That's what I did. Not because I couldn't, I thought I could, it wasn't a conscious thought that I can't ask these questions, but children are very perceptive. And so parents have to be the ones to keep that door open, to listen for what their children are saying. As an example, in my own family, my brother used to say, I hate that woman. The follow-up to that is, what woman? And my dad said, what woman? And he said, that other lady who gave me away. And there's a continued conversation there, right? That never happened. Likewise, the first poem that I ever wrote was called The Little Girl Inside of Me. And the poem says, alone and confused, shy and scared, hoping for tomorrows that will never come, dreaming impossible dreams, big sad eyes looking out at the world, looking and searching, wondering what's to be. That's the little girl inside of me. If somebody had seen that, if I had felt like I could share that, or if somebody asked me what I was writing about, they would have said, why do you feel so alone? Why do you feel so confused? What are you confused about? Why are you scared? And I might have been able to have a conversation about, I'm scared because I don't know who I am.
Right.
I'm scared because I don't know where I came from. And so for families navigating the complexity of adoption, please keep talking about it. Please keep the lines of communication open. And if you don't know how to do that, reach out to people who can provide this support to you. That means an adoption and trauma competent therapist who can facilitate those discussions. That means somebody like me whose work is to fill in the gaps of communication by giving adoptees and families language for these really hard conversations.
Yeah.
Because I didn't have these really hard conversations until just the last 10 years or so. And it has been really hard as a fully grown adult in my late 40s to have conversations with my parents in their 70s and now 80s about stuff that we should have talked about 30 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and I think one thing that I will say is, I know for me, if I'm ignorant about a topic, I'm afraid to talk about it.
Yeah.
And I know that goes for a lot of people, where it's like, I don't want to offend you or trigger you or do something that could be harmful to you. But by not talking about it, then it just kind of goes unspoken and gets pushed under the rug, which I know that's something that I've had to overcome for myself. I'm like, if I'm ignorant about something, I should curiously ask questions. And would you say that that's the best way to go is just having an open mind, having communication that continues, like an open conversation.
Yeah, I mean, the curiosity is the key. I love that you've used that word, and that's actually in the migrating toward wholeness process. One of the core principles is making space to heal. And as adopted people, and in our adoptive families, and in culture and society at large, we all need to make space to heal, and that's about inviting curiosity for the experiences that we have internally, so that we can start to express them and release what's keeping us stuck. Because when we don't express, and that's the emotional part of trauma healing, when we don't express what's inside of us, we don't feel safe to, or we don't feel comfortable to, or we don't allow ourselves to be curious to say, or what is that feeling attached to? Or why do I feel a little bit uncomfortable right now? Right? The part of this process is being able to sit with the discomfort. And sometimes we get uncomfortable because we're ignorant about a subject, and so we don't feel like we have the right questions. Well, there's an easy answer for that: education. Right? I mean, my first line of defense has been getting an intellectual understanding. There are tons of books out there. There's a whole website called adopteereading.com that has all the books listed that have been written by and for. It's largely books written by adoptees, but also books for adoptees, all kinds of resources that help people start to, if they don't have the knowledge, to build a knowledge base in order to be a little bit more curious about what's happening and about the kinds of conversations that are possible. But that's human nature, right? And when we're in relationship, the thing that keeps the connection alive is the continued curiosity.
Yeah.
Right? If I'm curious about what your day was like, I should also be curious about what it felt like when that thing happened to you.
Yeah.
Right? How does it make you feel when, And as humans, we're not always good at asking those kinds of questions.
Yeah, that's very true.
Because that requires a level of vulnerability and trust. But the way we build that trust is by continuing to show up in that space of curiosity and really listening to one another. And I will say one more thing that's really important, especially because often for adoptees, when we don't have language for what we're feeling, and we also haven't been, taught what healthy emotions are like, and what we feel and why. Right, that's the part of that emotional language that we don't always get to have. We communicate through behavior.
Right.
And so you have all these younger adoptees who are having tantrums, who are acting out in certain ways, who are, promiscuous behaviors, or, starting to drink or experiment with drugs when they're, 12 or 13 or 14. That's not a bad kid. That's a trauma response.
Right.
The behavior is is the communication for what they're not talking about.
Yeah. Wow. So taking all of that knowledge, you are obviously very well versed in knowledge of this. So talking about migrating toward wholeness, what all do you offer to people? What is your business model?
Yeah, so Migrating Toward Wholeness is a narrative healing approach. As I said, there's 5 core principles that we work through in all of the work that I do that are attached to the 7 parts of trauma healing. And it is a one-on-one or a small group coaching model. I also partner with organizations and agencies that are looking for lived experience experts to either deliver programming like wraparound services, which currently there's not a real, substantial amount of those, and we need them.
Right.
Because as I said, I developed this work because I built the thing that I needed but couldn't find. 14-year-old me could have really benefited from adult me.
Yeah.
And so I do one-on-one coaching. I do small group coaching. I run monthly drop-in circles, which are free for anybody who has an experience of trauma. Most of the people tend to be adoptees, but they are open to anyone in the community. And as I said, I do organizational and institutional partnerships. Sometimes I teach continuing education credits, and I'm always looking for new partnerships and new clients because this is really important work and it changes people's lives.
Yeah. I love that so much. And what kind of brought out your book? Well,
Yeah.
specifically this one, because I know you've done a lot of creative writing.
Yeah.
But specifically with this, I'd love to talk about it and kind of shout it out a little bit. So tell me.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So this book came, so the sort of foundational piece of my work is actually my award-winning solo show, Unmothered,
Yeah.
which people can view. The film version of it is available on my website, and then it's available as an engaged learning experience
Yeah.
for organizations and institutions. So that's another part of the work that I do. And Unmothered was really me making myself the subject of the research that then became this book. It was
Yeah.
me doing the 5 core principles, which are making space to heal, rewriting the truth, expressing the core or primal wound, becoming the subject, and then the 5th one is breaking silences. And it's a wheel. The process is a wheel because all of those things work together and they're connected to the 7 parts of trauma healing. And so Unmothered was me taking my story and putting it down on paper, using all of the poetry that I had been writing since the time I was 14 years old, and using it as the narrative thread.
Yeah.
To be able to tell the story of what it feels like to be an adopted person who doesn't have a connection to biology or history or roots, who didn't have access to appropriate mental health care, and who struggled to figure out who I was and what I was doing with my life.
Mm-hmm.
And so the show is me doing the 5 core principles, right? Recognizing that both the writing and the performance could be used as tools for processing and healing the trauma that was living in my body.
Yeah.
And then I ended up doing a pilot of the original Migrating Toward Wholeness group through the Rudd Adoption Research Program back in 2021 during the pandemic. They were very interested in the writing and healing work that I was doing. And we started to have conversations, and I said, well, what if I run a writing group with a group of adult adoptees?
Yeah.
And they were like, yes. And then from that really helped me to develop the method and the process for what the Migrating Toward Wholeness approach was.
Yeah.
In terms of what kind of writing we were doing, how we were using the writing, what the group dynamic was. And it was a very emergent process and relied really on what people were in the room and what they were bringing to each individual weekly session.
Yeah.
And then we were building on the stories that were being shared, and we were building on what was coming out of their writing. And so the book was then the follow-up to that original pilot group.
Okay.
And it lays out each of the 5 core principles, and then at the end of each chapter, there's a series of writing activities, which are activities that came out of that initial group, that are meant to be a springboard for people who are looking for a way into this work, sort of on their own, or they could do it with a therapist or, with a partner or a friend. And then the extension of that is then to come into one of my group spaces or one-on-one spaces or, workshops.
Yeah. How can we support you? Where can we find you? Can we buy your book somewhere? This is your opportunity. Spotlight's on you. Let's shout you out.
Yeah, so easy to find me. You can find me on the web at lizdebetta.com, LIZDEBETTA.com. And like I said, my film is available to view. My show is available on the film version to view on my website. And also, if you're interested in bringing that to your community or institution to support families that you might be working with who are navigating the complexity of adoption, please reach out. I would love to have that conversation. There's also a contact form on my website where you can reach out if you want to talk about working one-on-one or in a small group. And the book is available through Brill Publishers. It's an academic publisher, so it can be a little convoluted. It is also available through Amazon, which makes it a little bit easier. So
This has been a lovely conversation, and I think very eye-opening. Something that you don't learn about every day, and so I'm very grateful to have you on and to be able to learn more about that. Thank you so much for being on. And again, I am Derek with Small Business Spotlight, powered by Northlight Film Co. Make sure to shop local and support Liz. Thank you.